I'm Tori Brennan, and I'm 29 years old. Last Thanksgiving, my father stood up in front of 30 relatives and grounded me like I was a disobedient child because I dared to ask what my grandmother left me in her will. The entire room laughed. My face burned so hot, I could feel my pulse in my teeth. But I looked him dead in the eye and said one word, "All right." The next morning, he knocked on my bedroom door, smirking. "Finally learned your place?" he said. Then he saw the empty room. No clothes, no suitcase, no me. Before he could dial my number, the doorbell rang, and the family lawyer was standing on the porch, trembling, holding a briefcase full of documents my father never knew existed. "Mr. Brennan," he said, "what have you done? Before I tell you what was in that briefcase, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely speaks to you, and drop a comment, letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now." Now let me take you back to last September, the morning my grandmother died, and the first domino fell. My grandmother, Eleanor Brennan, passed on a Tuesday morning at Providence Portland Medical Center. She was 87. I got the call from my mother at 6:14 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was already awake, sitting at my drafting table in my 480 square foot studio apartment, sketching a rain garden for a client in Lake Oswego. Mom's voice was thin, like tissue paper held up to light. "It's Grandma Tori. She's gone." I drove the 20 minutes to the hospital in silence. No radio, no podcast, just the sound of Portland rain on the windshield and my own breathing. When I arrived, my father was already in the hallway. Richard Brennan, 63, retired state judge, 6'1", wearing a barber-waxed jacket even at dawn. He wasn't crying. He was on his phone, speaking to someone about estate paperwork. I heard the words, filing timeline and probate schedule, before he noticed me and ended the call without saying goodbye. My brother Garrett was beside him, 33. Dark suit even at a hospital, arm looped around Dad's shoulder like a running mate at a campaign stop. They looked like a unit, a wall. I stood at the far end of the corridor, alone, clutching a paper cup of vending machine coffee that I never drank. The last time I'd seen Grandma Eleanor, she was in her wheelchair in the garden of her colonial house on Hawthorne Street, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Tori," she'd said, her voice low so no one else could hear. "I've taken care of things. You trust me, okay?" I'd nodded, not understanding. Not yet. At the funeral 3 days later, the church was old Portland granite, tall nave, white lilies everywhere, a mahogany casket polished to a mirror shine. My father gave the eulogy. He spoke for 11 minutes about the Brennan legacy, about tradition, about how my son will carry this family forward. He mentioned Garrett by name 4 times. He mentioned my mother once. He did not mention me at all. Afterward, in the reception line, my Aunt Margaret's husband asked me what I did for work these days. Before I could answer, my father leaned in from behind. "She plants trees for rich people," he said, and a few people chuckled politely. I felt the burn start at my sternum and climb. I was turning to leave when a man I didn't recognize stepped forward. Older, silver-haired, wire-rimmed glasses with thin gold frames. He took my hand gently and shook it. "Your grandmother was very proud of you," he said quietly. "I'll be in touch." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd of black coats before I could ask his name. I didn't know it then, but that man was Harold Caldwell, and he was holding the key to everything. That evening, 15 of us gathered at the family house for dinner. The Brennan house, a white colonial on Hawthorne Street with a wrought iron gate and 100-year-old oak trees in the yard. My grandmother built that house with money from her side of the family, long before she married my grandfather. I always loved it. The crown molding, the deep windowsills, the garden out back where Grandma grew peonies, the color of ballet slippers. Inside, the long oak dining table was set with the family's sterling silver flatware, a set that had been in the Brennan name for 3 generations, candles in silver holders, a bottle of Willamette Valley Pinot Noir breathing on the sideboard, everything arranged to look like old money and perfect lineage. My father sat at the head, naturally. He raised his glass. Mom left everything to me to manage, he announced, scanning the table. I'll make sure the family assets are distributed to the right people, based on capability. His eyes landed on me. That means you don't need to worry about any of it, Tori. Complex things aren't really your area. Garrett nodded like a judge's clerk. His wife Meredith adjusted her Mikimoto pearl strand and said nothing. I set my fork down. Dad, Grandma told me. My mother was confused at the end. He cut in. Whatever she promised you, forget it. My mother, Linda, stared at her plate. She didn't look up. She never looked up. After dinner, I excused myself and went upstairs to the bedroom I'd grown up in. The Frank Lloyd Wright poster I'd taped to the wall at 16 was still there, edges curling. I sat on the bed and opened the nightstand drawer out of habit. Inside was an envelope that hadn't been there before, cream-colored stationery with a faint watermark, my name on the front in blue ink, in a handwriting I'd know anywhere, shaky but deliberate, Grandma's handwriting. My hands were trembling when I picked it up. I opened the envelope slowly, sitting cross-legged on the twin bed I'd slept in from ages 5 to 18. The ceiling fan above me wobbled the same way it always had. The room smelled like old wallpaper and cedar closet. Inside were 2 things. The first was a letter, 2 pages, front and back, in Grandma Eleanor's handwriting. The pen had pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper, as though she'd wanted the words to be permanent, physical, something no one could delete with a keystroke. The second was a photocopy, partial, maybe 6 pages out of what looked like a longer document. The header read, Irrevocable Trust Agreement, Eleanor M. Brennan, Settler. Halfway down the first photocopied page, highlighted in yellow, was a single line, Beneficiary, Victoria Tori Brennan. I read the letter with tears sliding down my face. Tori, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and your father is already doing what I knew he would do. I'm sorry I couldn't stop him while I was alive. I tried, in my way. But men like your father don't hear women. They only hear documents. The original trust is with my attorney, Harold Caldwell. His office is on Northwest 23rd Avenue in Portland. The copy I've left you is partial, not enough to prove anything on its own, but enough for you to know I'm telling the truth. Don't show this to anyone. Not your father, not Garrett, not even your mother. I love Linda, but she will tell Richard. Wait until the right time, and Harold will know what to do. You were always my architect, Tori, the one who builds. Don't let them tear you down. All my love, Grandma. I folded the letter back into the envelope and pressed it against my chest. The photocopy was incomplete. I couldn't use it as evidence. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't know who Harold Caldwell was, beyond a name and a street. And my grandmother had been in the ground for 48 hours. But for the first time in years, I felt something besides small. I felt like someone believed in me, had always believed in me, and had put it in writing. I drove back to Portland the next morning without saying goodbye. No one noticed. Or if they did, no one called. My studio apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Plants crowding every windowsill, drafting table covered in tracing paper, a cold mug of tea from 2 days ago still sitting by the sink. I loved this place, even though it was small enough that I could touch opposite walls if I stretched. It was mine, the one space in the world where no one told me I wasn't enough. I sat down at my laptop and Googled Harold Caldwell Attorney Portland. The results came up immediately. A small office on Northwest 23rd Avenue, solo practice, specializing in estate planning and trusts. A headshot showed a silver-haired man with wire-rimmed glasses, the man from the funeral. I hovered over the phone number. I didn't call. Not yet, because there was a part of me, the part my father had trained since childhood, that whispered, what if Grandma really was confused? What if this is nothing? What if you call and find out the one person who believed in you was just a sick old woman who didn't know what she was signing? I wasn't ready to risk that. Not yet. Instead, I turned to work. A landscape architecture firm in the Pearl District had a deadline in 2 weeks, a rooftop garden for a new condo development. I needed the paycheck. I was still carrying $38,000 in student loans, $420 a month, from the 1 year of law school I'd attended before dropping out to pursue design. The year my father said I betrayed the family. I was checking email to confirm the project specs when I saw it, buried between a newsletter and a shipping notification. An email from Garrett. No, not to me. Forwarded to me. By accident. Subject line. RE. Trust Amendment. Draft Petition. My stomach dropped. I clicked it open, scanned the first lines. Then my phone buzzed with the project deadline reminder, and I had to close the laptop and get to the office. But I'd seen enough. Enough to know that whatever my father was planning, it had already started. 3 weeks passed. I threw myself into work. The rooftop garden project consumed 16-hour days, and I let it, because focus was easier than fear. But the email sat in my inbox like a splinter under skin. I hadn't opened it again. I wasn't sure I wanted to. Then my mother called. Tori, your father wants the whole family together for Thanksgiving. Her voice had that particular thinness it got when she was relaying Richard Brennan's orders and pretending they were invitations. He says, he wants to mend things. I almost laughed. My father had never mended a thing in his life. He broke things and then told you it was your fault for being breakable. I'll think about it, Mom. Please, honey. He's trying. I said I'd let her know and hung up. Then I sat at my kitchen table, a second-hand IKEA piece I'd sanded and restained myself, and finally opened Garrett's accidentally forwarded email. It was a chain. 7 messages between my brother and my father, spanning 2 weeks. The subject line, Trust Amendment, Draft Petition, was exactly what it sounded like. Garrett had drafted a legal petition to the court requesting a change of beneficiary on Grandma Eleanor's trust. The grounds cited were financial incompetence of the named beneficiary, me. The petition argued that I had a pattern of unstable career decisions, no significant assets, and outstanding educational debt inconsistent with fiduciary responsibility. My brother had written that about me in legal language for a court filing. But the line that made my vision blur wasn't the legal jargon. It was the casual message Garrett had typed to my father at the bottom of the chain. She won't fight it. She never fights anything. That's the beauty of it, Dad. I sat there for a long time. Then I screenshot every message in the chain, uploaded them to my cloud drive, and backed them up on a thumb drive I kept in my sock drawer. I called my mother back. Tell Dad I'll be there for Thanksgiving. I was going home, but not to mend anything. The next morning, I called Harold Caldwell's office. A receptionist answered, an older woman with a warm, efficient voice. I gave my name. There was a pause. Then she said, Miss Brennan, Mr. Caldwell has been expecting your call. Can you come in today? 2 hours later, I was sitting across from him in a small office on Northwest 23rd Avenue. Bookshelves lined every wall, leather-bound legal volumes, dog-eared and tabbed. An oriental rug that had seen better decades covered the floor. On his desk, a coffee mug had gone cold. Harold Caldwell was the man from the funeral. Same silver hair, same wire-rimmed glasses with gold frames, same measured calm. He looked like a man who had spent his career choosing his words with surgical precision. Your grandmother hired me 20 years ago, he said. I drafted her original will, her living trust, and 8 years ago, after a conversation that troubled her deeply, she asked me to create an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. He opened a leather portfolio and slid a document across the desk. The original. Thick, cream-colored paper, a notary's red seal from the state of Oregon, signatures at the bottom. $620,000 in an educational trust managed by U.S. Bank, he said. Irrevocable means your father, as trustee, cannot alter the beneficiary. Any petition to do so requires either your written consent or a court ruling based on evidence of the settler's mental incapacity at the time of signing. He paused. Your grandmother anticipated this. She had her physician, Dr. Margolis, perform a cognitive evaluation the same week she signed. The results are in the file. She was fully competent. I exhaled. It was the first full breath I'd taken in weeks. There's more, Caldwell said. Your father filed a petition 3 weeks ago requesting a change of beneficiary. He listed Garrett. He told the court he was unable to locate you to obtain consent. The old lawyer's jaw tightened. You and I both know that's not true. I showed him the email chain. He read it without expression, then looked up. This is evidence of deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. If you want to fight this, you have everything you need. I want to fight this. He nodded. Then he said, almost as an afterthought, there's one more thing, Tori. Your grandmother also left you the cottage at Cannon Beach. It's included in the trust. I don't think your father knows about it. He never read the full document. I stared at him. The Cannon Beach house, the little cedar cottage where Grandma took me every summer, where we'd sit on the porch and watch Haystack Rock turn gold at sunset. She'd told me once it was her favorite place in the world. She left it to me. Harold Caldwell looked at me over his glasses. Your grandmother knew exactly what would happen after she was gone, and she spent the last 8 years making sure you'd be protected. He closed the portfolio. The question is, when do you want to use this? Thanksgiving, I said. He's invited the whole family, 30 people. Caldwell studied me for a long moment. Then, he gave a single, slow nod. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I packed a small bag, one change of clothes, my camel wool coat, the nicest thing I owned, bought second-hand from a consignment shop on Alberta Street, a toothbrush, and a manila folder, thick with notarized copies. The original stayed with Caldwell. We'd agreed on that. He would hold the master set in his office safe, and I would carry copies, notarized, stamped, admissible as secondary evidence if needed. The originals were for the courtroom. The copies were for the family. I drove south through the autumn hills of Oregon. The leaves had gone full amber and rust along the highway, and the sky was that particular northwest gray that couldn't decide between rain and resignation. The Brennan house appeared through the trees like it always did, white colonial facade, wrought iron gate, the ancient oak standing guard. From the outside, it looked like a postcard. This is what a good family looks like. That was the whole point. My mother met me at the door. She hugged me a beat too long, the way she did when she wanted to say something but wouldn't. Your father's in the study, she murmured. He's in a mood. I carried my bag upstairs, my old bedroom, the Frank Lloyd Wright poster, the twin bed, the nightstand drawer, now empty. I'd taken the envelope last time. From downstairs I heard Garrett's voice, then Meredith's bright, performative laugh, the clink of a wine glass. I knelt and slid the manila folder under the mattress. Then I went to the window. The backyard garden, Grandma's peony beds, was overgrown and grey. Nobody had tended it since she'd gotten too sick to kneel. The sight of it made my throat tight. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass and whispered to no one, I'm here, Grandma. Downstairs the Camus Cabernet was open. The granite fireplace was crackling, and my father hadn't stood up when I walked in. He looked at me from his leather chair and said, "Oh, you came." Garrett was on the sofa beside Meredith, swirling wine. He glanced at my coat, second-hand, slightly pilled at the elbows, and said, "Still haven't upgraded the car, huh, Tor?" I smiled, sat down, said nothing. Tomorrow 30 relatives would fill this house. My father had organized the largest Thanksgiving gathering in Brennan family history, far bigger than usual. I didn't know why yet, but a part of me suspected that Richard Brennan never did anything without an audience. Thanksgiving morning, the house filled like a theater before a show. Cars lined the street by 10 a.m. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Don from Bend, the Paulson cousins from Eugene, Great Aunt Judith, who flew in from Scottsdale. By noon, there were 32 people in the Brennan house, and the noise was a living thing. Laughter, clinking glasses, children running through hallways, the oven timer beeping every 20 minutes. I helped in the kitchen because nobody asked me to do anything else. Linda and Meredith sat at the breakfast nook drinking tea while I chopped celery for the stuffing. That felt about right. The family division of labor hadn't changed since I was 12. At 4 o'clock, we sat down to eat. The long oak table in the dining room seated 18. The overflow went to a folding table in the adjacent living room. I was placed at the folding table between my 9-year-old second cousin Oliver and an empty chair. My father stood at the head of the main table, crystal chandelier above him, linen tablecloth, white as a surrender flag, the family's sterling silver gleaming under candlelight. He raised his glass of Pinot Noir. "This Thanksgiving is special," he said, his courtroom voice, the one that filled rooms and closed arguments. "We've lost Mom this year, but the Brennan family endures, and I'm proudest of all of my son Garrett, who just won the biggest case of his career." He turned to Garrett. "To you, son." Applause. Garrett accepted it with practiced modesty, a slight nod, a hand on Meredith's shoulder. From the folding table, my Aunt Margaret called out, "What about Tori? Any good news, sweetheart?" I opened my mouth. "Tori is still finding her way," my father said, not looking at me. "She's creative. We'll give her that." A ripple of polite laughter. "But every family needs someone to remind the rest of us not to take a wrong turn. Right, Tori?" The laughter rolled across both tables like a wave, and I sat there, absorbing it the way I had since I was a child. Spine straight, face neutral, hands in my lap. Oliver, the 9-year-old beside me, looked up and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded and handed him a bread roll. After the plates were cleared and the pumpkin pie was half gone and the port wine was flowing, my father stood again. The room quieted. He had the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict. "One more thing," he said. "Tomorrow morning, I'll be making an important family announcement regarding Mom's estate. I expect everyone to be present." He smiled, the smile of a man who has already decided the outcome. It's what Mom would have wanted. I looked at Garrett. He was studying his wineglass with a small private smile. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the tablecloth. I looked at my father. He was looking right at me. And for 1 second, his smile sharpened into something that wasn't a smile at all. Tomorrow, he was going to read his version of the will, in front of everyone. I excused myself to do the dishes. The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of water running and my own breathing. I stood at the sink, scrubbing a roasting pan, suds up to my elbows, still wearing the same sweater I'd driven down in. In the next room, 32 people were laughing and drinking port, and not one of them had offered to help clear a single plate. I heard footsteps behind me. Garrett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, wineglass dangling from 2 fingers. "You know, Tor," he said casually, "you should really thank Dad for even letting you sit at the table, even if it was the kids' table." He chuckled at his own joke. I didn't turn around. I kept scrubbing. But something in me, some wire that had been pulled taut for 29 years, finally hummed. "Garrett," I said, my voice quiet and steady, Do you know what Grandma left me? The silence behind me changed texture. I heard his wine glass clink against the counter. When I glanced over my shoulder, his face had gone very still. He left the kitchen without a word. 10 minutes later, my father's voice thundered from the living room. Tori, get in here, now. I dried my hands on a dish towel and walked in. 32 faces stared at me. The crystal chandelier threw little rainbows across the ceiling. My father stood in the center of the room, port wine in one hand, the other hand pointing at me like I was a defendant. What did you say to your brother? His voice was the judicial baritone, the one designed to make people smaller. You threatened him? With the will? You think you can manipulate this family? I opened my mouth to respond. He didn't let me. You're grounded, he said. You are grounded until you apologize to your brother. Go to your room. The room erupted, not in protest, in laughter. 32 people, most of them adults, laughing because Richard Brennan had just grounded his 29-year-old daughter like she was a misbehaving child. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking. Uncle Don snorted into his port. Even Meredith let out a delicate, performative gasp that was really a giggle. My face burned. The heat climbed from my chest to my neck to my temples in a single wave. I looked for my mother. Linda was sitting in the corner chair, staring at her hands, silent. Nobody said stop. Nobody said that's enough, Richard. Nobody said anything at all except laughter. I looked at my father. His Cartier tank watch caught the light as he jabbed his finger toward the staircase. Go, he repeated. Now. I held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then I said, in a voice so calm it surprised even me. All right. I turned. I walked upstairs. I closed the bedroom door behind me. And then I picked up my phone and called Harold Caldwell. It rang twice. He answered. I said, Mr. Caldwell, I need you to bring the originals tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. There was a pause. Then his steady, measured voice, I'll be there. I hung up, set my alarm for 4 a.m., and sat on the edge of the twin bed in the dark, listening to the laughter still floating up through the floorboards, thinking, laugh, enjoy it, because that is the last time. I know. Right now, some of you are furious on my behalf, and honestly, I don't blame you. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been humiliated by your own family in front of a room full of people? Have you ever been put in your place by someone who was supposed to protect you? Have you? If you want to find out what happened the next morning when my father opened my bedroom door and found it empty, stay with me. And if this story is hitting close to home, tap that like button so I know you're still here. I left at 4:15 in the morning. No drama, no slamming doors. I packed my bag in the dark, slid the manila folder into my tote, and walked downstairs in my socks so the floorboards wouldn't creak. The only thing I left behind was the framed photo of Grandma Eleanor on the nightstand. Face down, I drove to a 24-hour diner 3 miles from the house, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and waited for daylight. At 7:42 a.m., I know because I was watching the clock, my phone lit up. A text from Garrett. Where are you? Dad's looking for you. I didn't respond. Inside the Brennan house, I'd learn the details later, from my cousin Danny. The morning unfolded like this. My father came downstairs at 7:30, freshly showered, wearing a pressed Oxford shirt, looking like a man about to chair a board meeting. He poured his coffee, scanned the room, and said, Someone go wake Tori, she's got an apology to make. Nobody moved. Not because they were standing up for me, because nobody wanted to deal with it. Richard climbed the stairs himself. He knocked twice, his judicial knock, crisp and expectant. Tori, it's morning. You ready to apologize to your brother? Silence. He opened the door. The bed was made. The closet was open and empty. The drawers were cleared. The room held nothing of me except the photograph of Grandma Eleanor, face down on the nightstand. like a final punctuation mark. Danny told me later that my father stood in that doorway for a full 10 seconds before his expression shifted, confusion first, then something darker. He came downstairs slowly. "Tori's gone," he announced to the 20-odd relatives still lingering over breakfast. His voice was flat, controlled. "She left, in the middle of the night, like a coward." Garrett looked up from his laptop and smiled. "Well," he said, "that settles it." My father nodded. "It certainly does. Now, I was planning to make the estate announcement at 10, but since the only person who might object has run away." The doorbell rang. My mother opened it, and there, on the front porch, in a grey suit, with a brown leather briefcase and an expression like a storm front, stood Harold Caldwell. "I'm Harold Caldwell," he said, "attorney for Eleanor Brennan. I need to speak with the entire family, right now." The dining room went quiet in stages. First the conversation nearest the front door, then a ripple of silence, spreading table by table, until even the children stopped fidgeting. Harold Caldwell walked into the room the way a man walks into a courtroom, unhurried, deliberate, and completely certain of his authority. He set his leather briefcase on the dining table, right on top of the leftover Thanksgiving linen, and unclasped it without sitting down. His hands, I was told, had a visible tremor, not from nerves, from anger. My father rose from his chair at the head of the table. He was taller than Caldwell by 4 inches, broader by 30 pounds. He used every bit of it. "Harold," the name came out like a warning. "You were not invited. This is my home." Caldwell looked at him. "This is the home that Eleanor Brennan built with her family's money, Mr. Brennan. And I'm here because I have a legal obligation, a fiduciary duty, to the beneficiary of her trust. Tori has no rights to. Tori is the sole named beneficiary of an irrevocable trust executed 8 years ago. You know this. You've known it since the day your mother signed it." The room was so still I could have heard the furnace click on 3 rooms away. 30 pairs of eyes moved between the two men like spectators at a trial, which, in a way, they were. Richard's jaw clenched. My mother was in cognitive decline. Whatever she signed was signed in the presence of 2 independent witnesses and accompanied by a physician's evaluation confirming full mental competency. Caldwell opened the briefcase and removed a folder. "I have the documentation here. Would you like me to read it aloud, Mr. Brennan, to everyone?" The question hung in the air. Aunt Margaret, seated near the window, leaned forward. Uncle Don put down his coffee cup. Even the children had gone silent. Richard Brennan looked at the folder in Caldwell's hands, the way a man looks at a loaded weapon pointed at his chest. Then he straightened his shoulders and said, very quietly, "Get out of my house." "Sir," Caldwell said, "what have you done?" What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind 100 times, because it was the moment the mask finally cracked. Not slowly, not gracefully, but in a sudden, ugly split right down the center. My father stepped toward Caldwell. I said, "Get out. You're trespassing. I'll call the police." "You're welcome to," Caldwell replied, not moving an inch. "And when they arrive, I'll show them the petition you filed with the court 3 weeks ago, the one where you claimed you were unable to locate the beneficiary of your mother's trust." He paused. "The beneficiary whose phone number you have, whose address you have, who was sleeping in this house last night." Richard's face went through a sequence, red, then white, then a kind of mottled gray that I'd never seen on a living person. Around the room I could see the reaction spreading, Margaret pressing her hand to her mouth, Uncle Don's brow furrowing, cousins exchanging glances. That's when Garrett stood up. My brother, the golden child, the lawyer, the one who always knew the right angle, stepped forward with his hands raised in a calming gesture. "Mr. Caldwell," he said smoothly, "I appreciate your concern, but any documents you're referencing can be contested in the appropriate legal..." You drafted the petition, didn't you, Mr. Brennan? Caldwell turned to face him. His voice was quiet, precise, surgical. You prepared a filing to change the beneficiary of an irrevocable trust on behalf of your father, who is also the trustee. I have the emails. Garrett's composure didn't shatter. It evaporated. One moment, he was a confident attorney. The next, he was a man whose mouth had gone slack and whose eyes had darted, involuntarily, unmistakably, to his father. Dad, he said under his breath, we need to talk, privately. Richard didn't even look at him. No, I have nothing to hide. Aunt Margaret stood up from her chair. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the particular authority of a woman who had watched a family lie to itself for decades and had finally had enough. Richard, she said, let the man speak. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, not loud, not defiant, but present, like the first cracks in a frozen lake before the whole surface gives way. My father looked around the room and saw, perhaps for the first time, that the audience he'd assembled for his own performance was no longer on his side. This is absurd, he said, but his voice had lost its courtroom resonance. It sounded smaller, thinner, like tissue paper held up to light. My father did what my father has always done when he feels the ground shifting beneath him. He escalated. Everyone, listen to me. He raised both hands, palms out, the gesture of a man restoring order in a courtroom. This man, he jabbed a finger at Caldwell, was hired by my mother years ago when she was already in decline. He's been filling Tori's head with fantasies. This is a family matter, and I will not have an outsider. Richard, Caldwell's voice cut through like a blade, I served your mother for 20 years. I am not an outsider, and I am here because you violated the terms of a legal instrument that you swore, as trustee, to uphold. Out. My father's voice cracked on the word. He pointed at the door. Get out of this house, right now, or I swear to God, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed his briefcase with a deliberate click, tucked it under his arm, and nodded. Not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, like a chess player recognizing the next 3 moves. I'll leave, he said calmly, but I'll be back at 2 o'clock this afternoon for the formal reading of Eleanor Brennan's estate, which you scheduled, Mr. Brennan. It's on your own calendar. He paused at the doorway. And I won't be coming alone. The front door closed behind him with a soft click. My father turned back to the room. 30 faces, some confused, some uncomfortable, a few. Margaret, Danny, openly skeptical. He smoothed his shirt, adjusted his watch, and reassembled his composure the way a man straightens a painting after an earthquake. I'm sorry, you all had to see that, he said. Tori hired some bargain basement lawyer to stir up trouble. It's what she does. She runs from responsibility and then causes chaos from a distance. He shook his head with practiced sadness. This afternoon, I'll read Mom's will properly, and everything will be clear. I promise you that. Garrett, who had been standing frozen by the sofa, sat back down and pulled his laptop onto his knees. His fingers moved quickly, deleting something I'd later realize. Emails. The room exhaled. People returned to their coffee, their conversations, their children. The crisis had been deferred. Richard Brennan was still in control, or so he believed. 2 o'clock was 5 hours away. The clock on the mantelpiece, a Waterford crystal anniversary piece that had belonged to my grandmother, counted every second. I was parked outside a Stumptown Coffee on Division Street, watching rain trace crooked lines down my windshield. My Honda Civic, 2014, 147,000 miles, a small dent in the rear bumper from a parking garage in college, was not the kind of car that made anyone look twice. And that morning, invisibility was exactly what I needed. My laptop was open on the passenger seat. At 8:17 a.m., I'd sent a formal email to the Trust Management Division at US Bank, requesting written confirmation of my status as beneficiary of the Eleanor M. Brennan Irrevocable Trust. At 9:41, the reply came from a trust officer named Patricia Langley. Dear Ms. Brennan, this is to confirm that you are the sole named beneficiary of the Eleanor M. Brennan Irrevocable Trust. Account announced. The trust corpus of $620,000 remains intact and has not been dispersed. A petition to amend the beneficiary designation was filed on October 14th by the current trustee, Richard A. Brennan, but has not been approved by the court. No disbursements can be made without your written authorization. I read it 3 times, then I saved it, backed it up, and printed a copy at the FedEx office 2 blocks away. At 11:15, Caldwell called. He threw me out, he said, with something that might have been dry amusement. Threatened to call the police. I know. My cousin Danny texted me. 2 o'clock, Tori. I'll be parked on the next block. You go in first. I follow. Okay. A pause. Are you sure about this? Once it's done, there's no going back. I looked out at the rain. A woman walked past the car, holding a little girl's hand, both of them splashing through puddles, laughing at nothing. The simple, stupid beauty of people who felt safe. I've been going back my whole life, Mr. Caldwell. Every holiday, every phone call, every time I swallowed something that should have made me spit. I'm done going back. Then, I'll see you at 2. I hung up, opened the mirror on my sun visor. The face looking back at me was pale, tired, and absolutely certain. I zipped my coat, checked the folder one last time, trust copy, notarized, bank confirmation, printed, email chain, screenshotted, and time-stamped. Grandmother's handwritten letter. Everything in order. Everything real. I started the engine. Inside the Brennan house, the morning stretched like a rubber band pulled too tight. Danny told me later what it looked like from the inside. After Caldwell left, the casual post-Thanksgiving ease had curdled. People were still talking, still pouring coffee, still picking at leftover pie, but the conversation had a new undercurrent. The kind of tension where everyone is discussing the weather, but thinking about the earthquake. Aunt Margaret cornered my mother in the hallway by the guest bathroom. Linda, she said quietly, is Richard sure everything is in order? That lawyer this morning didn't look like a man who was bluffing. My mother's eyes were rimmed red. I don't know, Margaret. Richard doesn't tell me about the finances. He never has. Margaret looked at her for a long moment and said nothing, which from Margaret said everything. In the kitchen, Danny pulled out his phone and texted me. You okay? What's going on? I replied. I'm okay. Be there at 2. Please be in the room when I get there. He wrote back instantly. I'm not going anywhere. Meanwhile, in my father's study, the room with the leather chair, the legal volumes on mahogany shelves, the framed photos of Richard shaking hands with various Oregon judges, my father was making phone calls. Danny heard him through the door, growing louder with each attempt. It was the Friday after Thanksgiving. Every attorney's office in Portland had their voicemail on. Richard Brennan, former judge, could not reach a single lawyer. Garrett appeared in the study doorway. Dad, he said carefully, maybe we should postpone the reading. Give ourselves time to... No, my father's voice was granite. I don't retreat. Not from Harold Caldwell, not from Tori, not from anyone. We do this today. Garrett closed his mouth. He looked, Danny said, like a man who has just realized the lifeboat has a hole in it. The Waterford clock on the mantelpiece struck noon. 2 hours. At 12:30, I walked into Caldwell's office for the last time before everything changed. He had the full dossier spread across his desk in 4 neat stacks. I sat across from him, and he walked me through each one, point by point, the way a surgeon reviews an X-ray before cutting. Stack 1. The original, irrevocable trust. Cream paper, notary seal, Eleanor's signature in blue ink. Steady, deliberate, nothing like the handwriting of a confused woman. Beside it, the physician's letter from Dr. Margolis, confirming cognitive competency at the time of signing. Date stamped. Countersigned. Stack 2. The email chain between Richard and Garrett, printed, with full metadata showing timestamps, sender addresses, and routing information. The words, "She won't fight it," highlighted in yellow on the last page. Stack 3. The letter from Patricia Langley, at US Bank, confirming my status as sole beneficiary and the intact trust balance of $620,000. Stack 4. A document I hadn't seen before. Caldwell slid it across the desk. The deed to the house on Hawthorne Street. I looked at him. "The Colonial," he said. "Your family home. The deed has been in Eleanor's name since 1981. She purchased the property with inheritance from her mother before she married your grandfather. Richard never owned it. He assumed, as he assumes most things, that it was his by default." Caldwell tapped the document. "Under the terms of the trust, upon Eleanor's death, ownership transfers to the named beneficiary." I stared at the deed. My father's house, the house where he'd sat at the head of the table, where he'd grounded me in front of 30 people, where he'd built his entire kingdom of authority, had never been his. "He doesn't know this," I said. "He never read the full trust document," Caldwell confirmed. "He read the first 3 pages, the ones that named him trustee, and stopped." Of course he did. Richard Brennan had never needed to read the fine print. He was the fine print. He was the final word. Or so he'd always believed. I gathered the 4 stacks into the manila folder. Caldwell placed the originals back in his briefcase. "I go in first," I said. "You come when I signal." "How will I know?" "You'll know." We shook hands. His grip was firm, and his eyes, behind those gold-framed glasses, held something I hadn't seen from any adult in my family since my grandmother died. Trust. At 1:45, I drove down Hawthorne Street for the second time in 24 hours. The rain had stopped. A thin November sun was pushing through the clouds, turning the wet street into a mirror. The oak trees along the block were almost bare now, their branches sketched black against the pale sky like cracks in porcelain. I drove slowly. I wasn't stalling. I was remembering. This was the street where Grandma Eleanor taught me to ride a bike, the sidewalk where she walked me to school the year my parents couldn't be bothered, the front yard where she'd knelt beside me in the dirt and shown me how to transplant a seedling without disturbing its roots. "The secret," she'd said, pressing my small hand into the soil, "is to take the whole root ball. You don't leave any part of yourself behind." My phone buzzed. "Linda." I pulled over and answered. "Tori, where are you?" My mother's voice was strained, pleading. "Your father is furious. Just come home and apologize, and this can all be over. Please." "Mom," I said, "I'm coming home, but not to apologize." A silence, then very small. "What are you going to do?" "The right thing." I hung up. Parked on the block behind the house, next to Caldwell's silver sedan. He was sitting in the driver's seat, briefcase on his lap, reading glasses on. He glanced at me through the windshield and gave a single nod. I got out of the car. Camel coat, canvas tote, with the manila folder inside. My hands were steady. The gate was open. The front door was unlocked. From inside I could hear voices. The murmur of 30 people assembled and waiting for Richard Brennan to tell them how the world was supposed to work. I walked up the porch steps my grandmother had built and pushed the door open. I slipped in through the kitchen entrance and stood in the hallway, just out of sight of the living room. Through the archway, I could see the scene my father had staged. The living room had been rearranged, chairs pulled from the dining room, the den, even the porch, all facing the fireplace, like pews facing an altar. 30 people, seated and attentive. Richard stood before them in his pressed Oxford, reading glasses perched on his nose, tortoise-shell frames, the ones he used to wear on the bench. In his hand, a single sheet of paper. He held it the way judges hold verdicts, high enough that everyone could see it, low enough that no one could read it. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "As you know, my mother's passing left certain matters to be settled. I've reviewed her wishes carefully, with input from Garrett, and I want to share the distribution plan she intended." He paused for effect. The room was silent. "The family trust will be consolidated under my management. The educational fund, $620,000, will be transferred to Garrett for stewardship of the next generation." He glanced up, as though checking his audience. As for Tori, a small, merciful smile. Mom wanted her to have a gesture of goodwill. $5,000. A few sympathetic nods. Meredith placed her hand on Garrett's arm. Garrett lowered his eyes in a performance of humility so polished it could have won an award. "Are there any questions?" my father asked. From the hallway, I took a breath, pulled the manila folder from my tote, and stepped into the room. Behind me, the front door opened quietly. Harold Caldwell walked in. "I want you to picture this for a second. You walk into a room. 30 of your relatives are sitting there. Your father has just told all of them that you're worth $5,000. He's holding a piece of paper like it's a gavel. And you're holding the truth. What would you do? Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the moment. Because what happened next in that living room is something nobody in my family has ever forgotten." Every head in the room turned. 32 faces, some surprised, some confused, a few genuinely pleased to see me. My cousin Danny, sitting in the back row, gave me a small nod. Aunt Margaret straightened in her chair. My father's expression went through 3 phases in 2 seconds: surprise, annoyance, then a hardening. The courtroom mask snapping back into place. "Well," he said, "the prodigal daughter returns." A few obligatory chuckles from the crowd. "I assumed you'd run off for good this time. Are you here to apologize to your brother?" "No," I said. My voice was level, calm in a way that surprised me, because my heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I was sure people could see it through my coat. "I'm here to hear the will, the real one." I walked past him, past his pointed finger, past his Cartier watch, past the chair where he'd held court for 30 years, and set the manila folder on the table beside the fireplace. Caldwell stepped in behind me. Briefcase, gray suit, the quiet authority of a man who had been doing this for decades. "What is this?" Richard said. The annoyance was curdling into something uglier now. "I told you this morning, get out of my house." I turned to face the room. Not my father. The room. The people. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, "but what my father just read is not my grandmother's will. It's not her trust document. It's a distribution plan he wrote himself." I placed my hand on the folder. "This is the original, irrevocable trust that Eleanor Brennan executed 8 years ago. It was filed with her attorney, Mr. Caldwell, and verified by U.S. Bank, the institution managing the trust fund." I opened the folder. My grandmother named one beneficiary. Me. Silence. Not the polite, performative silence of a family gathering. The absolute, atmospheric silence of a room full of people who have just realized they are witnessing something they cannot undo. My father's face drained of color, not gradually, all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. Aunt Margaret said, clearly and firmly, "Let her speak." Caldwell stepped forward. He opened his briefcase on the table beside my manila folder, removed the original trust document, and held it up so the room could see the notary's red seal, the state of Oregon, bright as a stop sign against the cream-colored paper. "This is the irrevocable trust of Eleanor Margaret Brennan," he said. His voice carried the way good lawyers' voices carry, without shouting, without strain. Executed on March 14th, 8 years ago. I was present at the signing, along with 2 independent witnesses, a retired clerk of court named Dorothy Haynes and a CPA named Robert Voss. Both are available to confirm. He began to read. The settler, Eleanor M. Brennan, hereby establishes this irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of her granddaughter, Victoria Tori Brennan. He paused and looked at the room over his glasses. Trust corpus, a sum of $620,000, held and managed by U.S. Bank, Portland, Oregon. Additionally, the real property located at 4714 Hawthorne Street, Portland, Oregon, deed recorded under Multnomah County, originally purchased in 1981, shall transfer to the beneficiary upon the settler's death. A gasp, audible, collective, swept through the room. Uncle Don leaned forward so far his chair creaked. Margaret closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and looked directly at my father. The house, someone whispered from the back row. She left her the house, Caldwell continued. As trustee, Richard A. Brennan was given administrative authority only. He was expressly prohibited from altering the beneficiary designation, dispersing funds without the beneficiary's written consent, or encumbering the real property in any way. Caldwell lowered the document and looked at my father. In the past 3 months, Mr. Brennan has filed a petition to change the beneficiary to his son Garrett, claiming he was unable to locate Ms. Brennan. He also failed to notify her of the trust's existence after Eleanor's death, as required by Oregon law. Caldwell reached into the briefcase and produced the printed email chain. He held it up, the yellow highlighting visible from across the room. These are emails between Richard Brennan and Garrett Brennan, in which Garrett drafted the fraudulent petition and Richard approved it. He read aloud the line that had burned itself into my memory. She won't fight it. She never fights anything. That's the beauty of it, Dad. The room turned to look at Garrett. My brother was sitting very still, his hand frozen on Meredith's arm. His face had gone the color of ash. Meredith slowly, carefully extracted her arm from under his hand and folded both of hers in her lap. Aunt Margaret shook her head. Uncle Don muttered something under his breath. Danny stood up from his chair in the back row and walked forward to stand beside me, not saying anything, just standing there, present. My father opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. She was confused, he said, but the words came out threadbare, worn through from overuse. My mother didn't know what she was signing. Caldwell's response was immediate and surgical. Your mother's physician, Dr. Helen Margolis, conducted a cognitive evaluation the same week as the signing. The results are documented and included in this file. He placed the medical report on the table. Eleanor Brennan scored in the 93rd percentile for her age group. She was sharper than most of the people in this room. A long beat of silence. Then, from the back, Great Aunt Judith, 81 years old, Eleanor's younger sister, who had said almost nothing for 2 days, spoke. Eleanor told me about the trust, she said quietly. 8 years ago, she said, Richard will try to take it, but I've made sure he can't. She knew. She always knew. My father looked at Judith, then at Margaret, then at the room full of faces that were no longer looking at him with respect or deference, or even polite neutrality. They were looking at him the way you look at something you've just discovered was rotten underneath. He had assembled his own audience, and they had just become his jury. My father turned on Garrett. The alliance, the one they'd built over 33 years of shared entitlement, collapsed in a single sentence. Say something. Richard's voice broke open, raw and jagged. You're the lawyer. Contest it. Do something. Garrett didn't move. He sat on the sofa, laptop still on his knees, and spoke in a voice so low that only the front row could hear him clearly. Dad, irrevocable means irrevocable. You can't contest it. I told you that from the beginning. You told me you'd handle it. My father's hand came down on the back of a dining chair with a crack that made the nearest cousins flinch. His knuckles went white around the wood. You said she'd never find out. And there it was. In front of 30 witnesses, my father confirmed every detail Harold Caldwell had just presented. Garrett had told him it was risky. Richard had pushed forward anyway. And both of them had agreed, in writing, that I was too passive to fight back. The port wine glass that Richard had been holding, the same one he'd been sipping from when he grounded me the night before, slipped from his other hand and shattered on the hardwood. The dark red pooled on the floor and spread slowly toward the Persian rug, and nobody moved to clean it up. Then something shifted. My father's posture changed. The aggression drained away, and in its place came something I had seen him use 1,000 times before, on my mother, on me, on anyone who cornered him. He softened his voice. He lowered his shoulders. He turned to me with glistening eyes. Tori, sweetheart. The word, sweetheart, landed like a counterfeit bill on a counter. I was only trying to protect the family's assets. You're young. You don't have experience with this kind of money. I was doing this because I love you. I looked at him, the man who had called my career a joke, who had seated me at the children's table, who had grounded me at 29 in front of every relative I had, who had told a court that he couldn't find me when I was sleeping in his own house. I let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then I said, "You didn't do this because you love me, Dad. You did this because you've never believed a daughter deserves the same as a son. And that's not love. That's control." My mother stood up. I hadn't noticed her crying, but her face was wet and her hands were trembling. She looked at my father, the man she'd been silent beside for 35 years, and said in a voice that shook but did not break, "You owe her an apology, Richard. You've owed her one her entire life." The room held its breath. My father looked at my mother as though she had spoken in a language he didn't recognize. Then he looked at me. Then at the 30 faces watching him. He said nothing. He turned and walked into his study and closed the door. In the minutes that followed, the room rearranged itself. Not the furniture, but the people. The invisible lines of allegiance that had structured every Brennan gathering for as long as I could remember shifted, quietly and permanently, like tectonic plates. Aunt Margaret reached me first. She pulled me into a hug that smelled like Chanel No. 5 and coffee, and she said, close to my ear, "Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now, sweetheart. So proud." Danny squeezed my shoulder. "I always knew you were the toughest one in this family," he said. "You just never needed to prove it before." Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years came forward. A handshake, a nod, a quiet, "I'm sorry, Tori," not all of them. Some stayed seated, uncomfortable, staring at the floor. A few stood up and left. Not in protest, but in the way people leave a room where something has broken that they don't know how to fix. Garrett rose from the sofa. He didn't look at me. He took Meredith's arm and walked toward the front door. Meredith paused in the hallway, reached up and unclasped her pearl strand, the Mikimoto necklace she'd been wearing all weekend like a badge of status, and dropped it into her coat pocket, as though she wanted to make herself smaller, less visible, less associated. Caldwell was already organizing the documents back into his briefcase. "I'll file the petition to remove Mr. Brennan as trustee first thing Monday morning," he said to me. "The court process takes approximately 30 days. In the meantime, the trust is frozen. No disbursements, no changes." I nodded. The living room was emptying slowly. The Thanksgiving linen on the table was creased and stained with port wine. The Waterford crystal clock on the mantelpiece read 2:47 p.m. The whole thing had taken 47 minutes. 30 years of silence answered in 47 minutes. Monday morning, Harold Caldwell filed 3 documents with the Multnomah County Circuit Court. The first was a petition to remove Richard A. Brennan as trustee of the Eleanor M. Brennan Irrevocable Trust. citing breach of fiduciary duty, specifically, failure to notify the beneficiary, misrepresentation to the court regarding the beneficiary's whereabouts, and unauthorized attempt to amend an irrevocable instrument. The second was a formal request to appoint Caldwell as interim trustee until I could designate a permanent replacement. The third was a complaint filed with the Oregon State Bar against Garrett R. Brennan, alleging violation of the rules of professional conduct, specifically drafting a fraudulent petition to benefit an immediate family member while concealing a conflict of interest. Within 2 weeks, the court granted the trustee removal on an interim basis. Richard didn't contest it. His own attorney, a man named Foster from a mid-tier firm in Lake Oswego, whom he'd finally managed to reach the following Monday, advised him bluntly that he had no legal footing. Irrevocable means irrevocable, Judge Brennan, Foster reportedly said, and the email evidence is damning. If you fight this, you'll lose, and it'll cost you $60,000 to find that out. The $620,000 educational trust was transferred to an account in my name at U.S. Bank. Patricia Langley, the trust officer, called me personally to confirm. The deed to 4714 Hawthorne Street was updated. My name replaced Eleanor's as owner. The colonial house, the wrought iron gate, the oak dining table, the garden where my grandmother grew peonies, was mine. And Garrett, the golden child, the family's pride, received a formal notice of investigation from the Oregon State Bar. The process would take months, but the outcome was already taking shape. A 6-month suspension of his license for ethical violations. His largest client, a commercial real estate firm, dropped him within days of the complaint becoming semi-public. He quietly transitioned to corporate consulting, a job that required no bar membership and conveniently no courtroom appearances. My father called me once, 3 days after the filing. I answered because I thought, even then, even after everything, that maybe he would say the words. He didn't. He said, "You've destroyed this family." I said, "No, Dad, you did. I just brought the receipts." He hung up. I haven't heard from him since. 2 weeks after the court order, I drove to Hawthorne Street with a single key on a plain brass ring that Caldwell had handed me across his desk. "It's yours," he'd said simply, and for some reason, those 2 words undid me more than anything else had. I parked on the street. The oak trees were completely bare now, their branches a lattice against the December sky. The wrought iron gate swung open with a creak that I'd heard 10,000 times. The porch steps, Grandma Eleanor had them replaced in 2009. Cedar over the old pine, still had her welcome mat, faded green, a pattern of ferns. I turned the key. The door opened into the foyer, and the smell hit me first. Wood polish, old books, a trace of the lavender sachets my grandmother kept in every closet. The house was silent in a way I'd never experienced. My father's presence had always been the dominant frequency here, his voice filling every room, his opinions occupying every conversation. Without him, the house breathed differently. It breathed like it was finally resting. I walked through each room slowly. The living room, where 30 people had sat and watched my life change. The dining room, with the oak table still bearing faint water rings from port glasses. The kitchen, where I'd scrubbed a roasting pan alone while my family laughed in the next room. Upstairs, my bedroom. The poster, the twin bed, the nightstand with the empty drawer. Grandma's master bedroom. Her reading chair by the window, a stack of novels on the side table, a pair of glasses she'd never wear again. Then, the garden. I stood at the back door and looked out at what had been Eleanor Brennan's pride, the peony beds, now brown and tangled, edged with overgrown boxwood. The stone path she'd laid herself was barely visible under dead leaves. The bird bath was dry. I knelt, pressed my palms flat against the cold earth, closed my eyes. "I'll fix it, Grandma," I said. "I'll bring it back." And I knew, with the certainty that only grief and love and good dirt under your fingernails can give you, that I would. A week later, on a Saturday morning cold enough to see my breath, I drove 90 minutes west to Cannon Beach. I hadn't been there in 6 years. The last time was the summer before Grandma's health started to decline. The two of us, sitting on the porch of the cedar cottage, drinking chamomile tea, watching Haystack Rock turn amber in the sunset while the tide pulled back and left the sand gleaming. She'd said, "This is my favorite place on earth, Tori. When I'm gone, I want someone who loves it to keep it." I thought she was being sentimental. She was being precise. The cottage was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was bigger. Weathered cedar shingles, a porch that wrapped around 2 sides, salt air so thick you could taste it. The key, another brass one, also from Caldwell, turned smoothly, and the door opened onto a space that still smelled like her. Lavender, old paperbacks, the faintly sweet scent of cedar walls in winter. On the kitchen table, there was a wooden box, not hidden, placed there deliberately, as though she'd known exactly who would come through the door and when. I lifted the lid. Inside, a stack of photographs, Grandma and me, ages 5 through 22, in this very cottage, planting beach grass in the dunes, building a driftwood fort, standing in matching rain boots on a stormy July afternoon, both of us grinning like idiots. Under the photographs, a letter, short this time, just a few lines. "Tori, if you're reading this, you were brave enough. I knew you would be. This house is yours. It always was. I was just keeping it warm for you. Start over here if you need to, or come when the world is too much. Either way, it's waiting. I am so proud of you. Always. Grandma." I sat on the porch, her porch, my porch, and cried. Not the way I'd cried in the twin bed at Hawthorne Street, stifled and ashamed. This was different. This was the kind of crying that opens something instead of closing it, the kind that leaves you lighter, not emptier. The ocean was gray and vast, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in that living room, and there was a strange comfort in that. The tide didn't care about Richard Brennan's courtroom voice. The waves didn't know what an irrevocable trust was. Haystack Rock had been standing there for 15 million years and would keep standing long after all of us. The Brennans, the grudges, the folding tables were gone. I wiped my face, took a breath of salt air, and for the first time in months, felt something I'd almost forgotten the shape of: peace. That Sunday night, back in Portland, I sat at the oak dining table in the Hawthorne house, my house, and wrote an email to my family. I wrote it once, read it twice, and sent it without a third draft, because I knew if I kept revising, I'd start softening things that needed to stay sharp. 2. Richard Brennan, Linda Brennan, Garrett Brennan. I don't want to cut anyone out of my life. That was never the point. But I will not return to a relationship where I am belittled, dismissed, or treated as less than. If you want to have a relationship with me, it will be on terms of mutual respect, not hierarchy. The door is open. But it swings both ways now. Tori, my mother called 20 minutes later. She was crying. The real kind, not the anxious kind. "I'm so sorry, Tori," she said. "I should have stood up for you years ago. I was afraid of him." "That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." "I know, Mom," I said. "I don't blame you. But I need you to start choosing what's right, not what's easy. Can you do that?" A long pause. Then, "I'm going to try," Garrett replied by text the next morning. 2 words. "I understand." I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. Understanding was a start, but it wasn't the same as accountability. He'd get there or he wouldn't. That was his work, not mine. My father didn't respond. Not that day, not the next week, not the week after that. The silence was its own kind of answer. Familiar, really. Richard Brennan had been silent on the things that mattered my entire life. At least now, I'd stopped waiting for him to speak. 6 months later, spring had come to Portland, and the peonies were coming back. I'd spent the winter on my hands and knees in my grandmother's garden, pruning, clearing, aerating the soil that had gone sour from 2 years of neglect. The roots were deeper than I'd expected. They'd survived the abandonment. They just needed someone to cut away the dead weight and let the light in. I knew the feeling. With the student loan gone, paid in full, $38,412, the most satisfying check I've ever written. I used a portion of the trust to lease a small studio space in the Alberta Arts District. Brennan Landscape Design. My name on the door, my grandmother's name really. The Brennan name meant something different to me now. The Hawthorne house had become both home and office. I converted the downstairs study, Richard's old throne room, the one with the mahogany bookshelves and the leather chair, into a design studio. I replaced his legal volumes with plant identification guides and stacked the shelves with soil samples and seed catalogs. It felt right. It felt like rewriting. Danny came by on weekends to help with the garden. Aunt Margaret called every Sunday morning, sharp at 9. Just checking in, she'd say, and then we'd talk for an hour. Linda came to visit for the first time on a Thursday afternoon in April, the first time she'd entered the house without Richard beside her. We didn't say much. We planted tulip bulbs along the front walk, side by side, and that was enough. Richard rented an apartment across town. I heard through Margaret that he told his friends I'd stolen the house, that my grandmother had been manipulated, that the whole thing was Caldwell's fault. The story changed depending on the audience, but it always had the same ending. Richard Brennan was the victim. Some things, I suppose, are truly irrevocable. Garrett's suspension from the Oregon State Bar lasted 6 months. He'd moved to corporate consulting. Something with logistics, Margaret said. He and Meredith had quietly separated, though I didn't know the details and didn't ask. He hadn't contacted me since the I understand text. I left the door open, the way I said I would. I just wasn't going to stand in the doorway waiting. I'm telling you this story from the porch of the Cannon Beach cottage. It's a Saturday. The tide is out. Haystack Rock is doing what it always does, standing there, solid and ancient, and unbothered by anything as temporary as a family argument. I come here on weekends when I need to remember what quiet sounds like. The cottage is exactly as Grandma left it, except I've added a small herb garden by the front steps. Rosemary, thyme, lavender, the kind of plants that get stronger the more wind they take. I'm not telling this story to teach anyone a lesson. I don't believe in that. Every family is its own country, with its own laws and its own wars, and the people inside it are the only ones who know the real map. I can't tell you what to do with your father, your mother, your brother, your inheritance. I can only tell you what I did. Here's what I know now. Silence isn't agreement. I spent 29 years being quiet at the dinner table, and the people around me took that silence and called it consent. It wasn't. It was just a woman who hadn't found her evidence yet. Waiting isn't weakness. My father and my brother counted on the idea that I wouldn't fight. They were almost right. What they didn't account for was that there's a difference between someone who can't fight and someone who's choosing when to. And the last thing, the thing that matters most, my grandmother didn't leave me money. She left me proof. Proof that someone in my family saw me, the real me, the one who builds things, and decided I was worth protecting. Not with words, with documents, with plans, with the kind of love that hires a lawyer and thinks 8 years ahead. That's the inheritance that changed my life. Not the $620,000, not the houses, the knowledge that I was worth the trouble. I still have the Frank Lloyd Wright poster. It's on the wall of my studio now, behind my drafting table, edges still curling. I look at it every morning and think about the girl who taped it up at 16, who wanted to build beautiful things and was told that wasn't enough. She was enough. She was always enough. She just needed the paperwork to prove it. Early morning, the hawthorn garden. The soil is damp from last night's rain, and the air smells the way Oregon air smells in spring, green and clean, and full of the particular promise that comes from things deciding to grow. I'm on my knees in the dirt, planting peonies, the same variety my grandmother grew, Sarah Bernhardt. She always said, because she was dramatic, she was pink, and she lasted longer than anyone expected. Grandma had a sense of humor about everything, even flowers. The roots go in, the soil goes over. I press it down gently, firmly, the way she taught me. The whole root ball, nothing left behind. The sun clears the roofline and falls across the garden in long, golden bars. Somewhere in the house, my coffee is getting cold. Somewhere in Portland, my father is waking up in a rented apartment and telling himself a story where he's the hero. Somewhere in the future, maybe, he'll stop. I stand up, wipe the dirt from my hands, and notice something on the front porch that wasn't there last night. An envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, in handwriting I'd know anywhere. Not Grandma's this time, but almost as familiar. I open it. A single line. I'm sorry I never stood up. I'm standing now. Mom. I fold the letter. I tuck it into my coat pocket, right next to the one from Grandma. The one I carry everywhere. The cream-colored stationery with the blue ink and the words that saved my life. 2 letters. 2 women. One who planned ahead and one who finally caught up. I walk back into my house, the house my grandmother built, the house my father lost, the house that was always meant for someone who would take care of it. I close the door, and for the first time in 29 years, it feels like coming home. Thank you for staying until the end. I mean that. If this story made you feel something, anger, relief, recognition, hope, then it did exactly what I needed it to do. Hit like if it resonated. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and check the description below. There's another story waiting for you there, and I think you might need to hear it too. I'm Tori Brennan, and that was the last time I ever sat at the kids' table.